discussing Woodrow Wilson's progressivism in the context of the conditions of, you might say, the early 20th century. It was a dramatic break from earlier American political traditions, and it reflects a deep divide in the Enlightenment between roughly the followers of John Locke and those of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So we're going to be talking at the beginning today, just very quickly and lightly, about a little bit of the background of Western political philosophy in the Enlightenment. And then we'll move on to what is so radical about Wilson's break from that. Let's begin by thinking about the Enlightenment, and specifically the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I actually am not going to get to Kant here. I forgot his name was there. So, let's talk about, this question. What makes government authority legitimate? The government has awesome power over you and over all of us. It can fine you. It can imprison you. It could even put you to death. That is a tremendous amount of power. What enables that to be legitimate? What gives government the right to actually enforce the law and exercise authority over people within its domain? Well, the idea of the social contract was developed during the Enlightenment. To answer that question, the rough idea is that government authority is legitimate if it is rational. In the following sense, if people would voluntarily submit to its authority, if it would be reasonable for you to choose to live under government rather than choose the alternative. So the central idea is really that government and its authority are rational. It is rational to be subject to a government. The alternative would be worse. Now, why is that true? Well, the social contract theorist asks you to contemplate two situations: the state of nature and then a condition under government. So the state, government, alternatively, a situation of no government, anarchy, what they refer to as the state of nature. Which would you choose? Now, I want to actually ask you for a moment, which would you choose? Suppose you have an alternative here. You can either choose to live under the authority of government, or you could choose to live in a condition of anarchy with no government authority at all, at any level. What would you choose?
Government.
Government, why?
Let's just say you kill my brother, so now I want to kill you. So then, if I kill you, your brother's gonna want to kill me. So there has to be someone that wants to, like.
Okay. Okay, yeah, good. I mean, that guy's leaning far away from you because you didn't put the word "if" in there. It sounds like he's saying, "You kill my brother, that guy's to die." But no, good. Suppose I kill his brother, and he kills me, then my brother tries to kill him, then his brother tries to kill my brother, and actually then I'm out of brothers. but yes, that would be the kind of thing you might expect to happen in the state of nature. The key question really becomes that. What would the situation be like if there were no government authority at all? No police, no fire, no courts, no nothing. Yeah?
The problem is you're not defining how much government or what kind of government as opposed to how much anarchy or what kind of anarchy you have.
Ooh, good. You're not defining what kind of government, or for that matter, what kind of anarchy. Both are important because we're going to have to figure out if government has authority, how far that authority extends. Do I just agree to let government have any power at all over me, or do I put constraints on it? That's a critical question. And the answer to some extent depends on my idea of the state of nature. What kind of state is it? What would things be like if there were no authority at all? Now, his answer is one answer, which is there would be chaos. There would be these cycles of revenge. It would be the Hatfields and the McCoys, feuds, and we would be desperate to get out of that situation. But that isn't the only alternative. What do you think would actually happen in Austin if the government just shut down tomorrow? There were no authority whatever. Well, a lot of shooting, somebody said. But
People would make their own police stations, their own fire stations.
ooh, okay, yeah. One possible answer is, look, there'd be chaos. There'd be shootings, there'd be robberies, and so on. But another alternative is people would band together and form their own police forces, their own fire departments. They would do things to protect themselves. And so there are, in the Enlightenment period, alternative answers. One answer is that there would be absolute chaos. Thomas Hobbes gives that answer. He was born prematurely in 1588 when his mother heard about the approach of the Spanish Armada. Fear and I were born twins, he said. And his answer is you would choose government. Why? Because life in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He thinks it would be a state of chaos, a war of all against all, he says, where everybody would be fighting everybody else for limited resources. Our desires always are greater than what's available, and so there's a scarcity of goods. People are going to fight over the goods. They're going to fight with no rules at all, basically, if there is no government, and so life would be very difficult. Now, as a result of that, you'd be willing to trade away a lot of your freedom in order to gain security. And that's the basic trade-off for Hobbes. You would give up liberty in order to gain security. And that trade would be rational. You'd be willing to give up a substantial portion of your freedom. And in fact, Hobbes thinks of himself as justifying monarchy here, the rule of an absolute king. You would be willing to submit to the rule of even a tyrant, even someone with absolute power, putting no real limits on their authority, if that person kept you safe. Well, that's one answer to the question. He does think that even in the state of nature, there would be basic principles, natural laws that you would follow. These natural laws are not really given by nature as such. They are given by nature together with reason, by what is reasonable in the state of nature. And he says the first thing is I would seek peace. I would try not to get in trouble and not get into fights. But secondly, I would prepare to defend myself. There's a bumper sticker I've seen that says, you cannot simultaneously hope for peace and prepare for war. Actually, Hobbes would think, no, it's the opposite. You must both hope for peace and prepare for war. Being prepared is the best chance you have for seeking peace. But finally, he says, you'd be willing to surrender some liberty for peace. All liberty? Well, maybe in an extreme case, yes. But he says you might seek to preserve as much for yourself as you are willing to allow others. And so he thinks the best trade-off would not be one where you submit to an absolute authority, but you retain the freedom you're willing to give other people against yourself. Will you retain the right to kill other people? No, because you don't want to be killed. Will you retain the right to practice your religion? Maybe, if you're willing to allow other people to practice their religion. Well, that's one possible answer. Now, there is an alternative, which is in John Locke. In Locke, rationality does justify government, but it also puts limits on its authority. It's something that allows for government, but only within certain boundaries, and those boundaries are pretty strictly defined. So Locke says, yes, in a state of nature, there would be a state of equality. We are all born equal, he says. Not equal in ability, not equal in strength, but equal in what exactly? In human rights, in moral status. We are all equally human beings, all equally given dignity as human beings, and that means nobody has a natural right to rule over anybody else. Aristotle thought some people were born rulers, and others were born subjects. He even thought some people were born slaves. And Locke responds saying that's ridiculous. Nobody is born to rule, nobody is born to be a slave, nobody is born to be a subject. The simple question is that, well, what's best for us all? How should we organize society in a way that's best? There is no prior order we have to match. Nobody has any intrinsic political authority. It's in that sense that everyone is created equal. Now, he does say, in the state of nature, we would have a state of liberty, but not a state of license. It would not be a state of war of all against all. Life would not be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And for exactly the reason he mentioned over here, actually, there's a prior reason. There would be a law of nature that people would be banding together to enforce. Namely, that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. We would know that murder is wrong, even in the state of nature. It's not that there's a law against it that makes murder wrong. It's wrong intrinsically. And the same thing is true of theft. The same thing is true of kidnapping. The same thing is true of various other assaults on life, liberty, and property. And so Locke says, even in the state of nature, we would recognize certain things as wrong, and our response would be to band together to try to protect ourselves. We would form voluntary associations. Now, why isn't that enough? Well, because basically we might be unjustly accused. And so the danger in the state of nature isn't really a war of all against all. It is rather that there might be, well, think about what would happen in the Old West, let's say, when there really was no political authority in a territory. There were initial settlers in that region, but if they had not yet organized to form even a territorial government, what happened in those Old West towns? What happened if somebody in particular committed a crime? They might get hanged by whom? The community, yeah, there would be a posse formed, right? People would take the law into their own hands. Now, sometimes they would do it in the right way, but sometimes not. Would you trust a posse, some group put together by the people who had been victimized, let's say, to go out and find a criminal? Would you trust a posse to deal with people fairly? No. And Locke says that's the problem. It really isn't that murders, theft, and so on would go unpunished. It's that there would be a lot of bias, a lot of problems in the way it actually got enforced. And so he says, here's the thing. I would give up my own right to enforce the law of nature in order to gain impartial judgment. After all, if we have a posse formed in some community to enforce the law, who's going to be a member of the posse? The people most affected, right? Let's say if it was my brother who's killed, but I'm going to put together the posse. That means I'm going to be judge, jury, and executioner of somebody who injured someone who was dear to me. Suppose people are going around stealing cattle. It's the people who've had their cattle stolen who are going to put together the posse. They are the least likely to be impartial. And so we're going to expect a lot of mistakes, a lot of injustices. And Locke said we would protect ourselves from that kind of injustice by forming a government. And so his idea is I would give up my right to enforce the law, but I would gain out of that impartial judgment. There's a different model that emerges a bit later in the Enlightenment with the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher. He wrote two works, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and then also on the Social Contract, that really defined his political philosophy. There are many other works, and many of them have impacts on this as well, but these are the two key works that he wrote having to do with political philosophy. And in the first, well, there's this sense that all rights really come from the state, that if we're left to our own devices, we will find ways of enforcing the law, but the result of that will be great injustice. The only solution to that problem of injustice is to view all rights as being issued by the state. He also is convinced that changing institutions will change human nature, and that's a theme we'll come back to on Friday. He has a big influence on Karl Marx, for example. But I'm not going to go through the details of this. That'll be relevant when we get to Marx, and we'll come back to it. But the key idea is really this. In Locke, we have a bottom-up model. Some rights are natural. They reside in us, inherent in us as human beings. We grant some of those, but only some of those to government, giving government some power over us, but keeping government within very strict constraints. And so the government derives its power from the rights of individuals. Government doesn't start out with the power. Government gets power from us. And in particular, we take some of our rights and hand them over to the government because we get something in return, impartial judgment. In Rousseau, it's very different. It's a top-down model. All rights are in the end civil rights. They are granted by government. Apart from government, you have no rights at all, Rousseau says. And what that means is that since our rights derive from government, that the government's power is in principle unlimited. Now in practice, he says, it's limited by the general will. That is to say, the common good. The government should act for the common good of the people. However, in principle, there's nothing that constrains the government and forces it to do that. Since all of our rights are derived merely from the government, there are no, in principle, limits to government authority. That's the kind of issue that emerges in American politics early in the 20th century. In 1905, there was a Supreme Court case called Lochner versus New York that established a sort of Lockean paradigm for the way that American law would proceed. Throughout the 19th century, this had been more or less the way things had been handled, but it wasn't really encoded in Supreme Court jurisprudence until 1905. Here was the situation. In 1895, New York State passed a law, the Bake Shop Act, that, among other things, limited bakers to working 10-hour days and 60-hour weeks. This was at a time when a transition from 10-hour days to 8-hour days was just beginning. Lots of people worked a 10-hour day that was thought to be standard at the time. A lot of people were pushing for an 8-hour workday and a 40-hour work week. In any event, Lochner's Home Bakery in Utica, Lochner is there on the right, was fined for letting an employee work more than 60 hours a week. The first time this happened, he was fined $25. The second time, he was fined $50. And he sued, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. $50, by the way, was a lot more in 1905 than it is today. In any case, the Supreme Court ended up holding that New York's law was an unreasonable, unnecessary, and arbitrary interference with the right and liberty of an individual to contract. So they held that it was not legitimate for the government to limit working hours. And the same reasoning was applied to strike down, for example, minimum wage laws and a variety of other kinds of legislation that had to do with working hours, working conditions, and so forth. Now, not in all cases, the court allowed to stand a limitation on the working hours of miners because mining was a dangerous occupation. And one of the key questions here is working in a bakery a dangerous occupation? They analyzed statistics and said, well, no, being a baker is really no more dangerous than any other occupation. And so, really, people should be free to work however many hours they want to work. Here is the key part of the decision. The act is not within any fair meaning of the term a health law. It's an illegal interference with the rights of individuals. And so look at the last part in particular, statutes of the nature of that under review, limiting the hours in which grown and intelligent men may labor for their living, are mere meddlesome interferences with the rights of the individual. And that was the way that things went under American law from 1905 until 1937, when, as we'll see, this decision was overturned by the Supreme Court and the power of government greatly expanded. The case rested on the 14th Amendment. That was an amendment enacted after the Civil War in 1868, and it reads in Section 1 this way. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. And the last part has become very important since then, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's called the Equal Protection Clause. This case was decided under the Due Process Clause, which came just before it. And actually, some legal scholars have argued it would have been much better argued under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which I've also italicized there at the beginning. But in any case, the idea was, can you deprive somebody of their right to contract, which is a kind of privilege and immunity, but which also might be argued to be part of your general rights to life, liberty, and property, without what? What does it take for government to actually legitimately restrict your freedom? And that becomes the key question here. Under what conditions can the state restrict liberty? Well, one answer, which had been developed throughout the 19th century, was John Stuart Mill's. The government may restrict your freedom only to prevent harm to others. It can stop you from doing something only if somebody else will be at risk as a result of what you're doing. Let's say I decide I want to do Taekwondo. Should the government have the right to prohibit me from doing it? No, unless my practice of Taekwondo involves harming other people or in putting a risk on other people. I mean, it might, right? If I'm simply going like this, that seems fine. If I go over here into the front row and start going like this, then you might be, well, wait, yeah, no, you're not allowed to like bump into other people and hit other people as you're doing this. And so the idea is I should be free to do what I want as long as it doesn't present any risk of harm to other people. What if it harms me? Well, Mill says only if it would be completely irrational of me to agree to that. So if it's an unreasonable risk that I'm taking, then maybe yes. He talks about a person who wants to cross an unsafe bridge, for example, and there are other conditions he considers. But basically, look, I should be allowed to do what I want unless I am creating a risk for other people, as long as there's any rational basis for what I'm doing. Well, the Supreme Court's decision was immediately highly controversial. Oliver Wendell Holmes had an objection to it, a dissenting opinion that was influential. And the key question becomes this: what was the purpose of the Bake Shop Act? For whose good? That's what the Latin term cui bono means. For whose good? Who benefits from this? One side was saying, look, this is about health and safety. It's simply the government protecting people who work in bakeries. But the other side said, no, that's not what it's about. It doesn't have an effect on health and safety. What is really going on here? Who benefits? And in particular, you might ask, who would agree to work for more than 10 hours a day or 60 hours a week in a bakery? Now that's a serious question. To us, it might sound like, gee, I don't know, I wouldn't. On the other hand, stop and think a moment. This is 1905. And if you want to update it, think who today would be willing to work longer than an 8-hour day, longer than a 40-hour work week? Yeah. Oh, somebody has a large family to provide for and needs the money, right? So that's one person who would be willing to do this. Who else? Yeah.
Anyone going for like a desperate situation, like a refugee or an immigrant of some kind.
Oh, good. Somebody is in a desperate situation, a refugee, an immigrant, and indeed this was a period of huge immigration into the United States from the 1880s roughly up until the 1920s. There was a vast influx of people in the United States, and so a lot of those people would have been willing to do this. Who else? Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, single moms, single dads, that's right. People in a situation where they really had to support a family and they didn't have the usual circumstance around to help them. Others, yeah. People who don't want to go home, yes, right. Yeah, I mean, that might sound funny, but actually there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time at work, a lot more time than they have to, just because it's more fun at work than it is at home. And that might be because they're single and they have nothing else to do. It might be because they have a really unpleasant home situation, etc. Yeah. Yeah, people who are now unemployed. If the alternative is being unemployed or working for 70 hours a week in a bakery, you might think, yeah, I'll take the 70 hours a week. Well, that'll be my first choice, but it's better than the alternative. So that's certainly an option. Yeah.
You get paid very little.
Yeah, if you get paid very little, you might think, well, either I just settle for very low wages or I work more hours. And there are lots of people who would like to work more hours because they don't make much an hour. And they compensate by working lots of hours. Yeah.
People paying off student debt.
People paying off student loans. Yes, exactly. You might think, you might think, just wait. Yeah.
Maybe people that just love what they're doing and they're making a lot of money doing it.
Oh, people who love what they're doing and making a lot of money. Yeah. Baking is in a way an interesting example because people want fresh baked goods available when they're on their way to work in the morning, which means most bakeries, the jobs start at 3 or 4 in the morning. And if you think about that, 10 hours starting at, say, 3 in the morning, that actually means you're done by 1 p.m. Right? And you might actually be, let's say, working in the bakery, and actually the bakery's doing really well, business is good, you don't want to shut down or have your entire staff change at 1 o'clock. And so yeah, it might be like, oh, business is good, we're doing well, we want to keep doing it, and we're all making lots of money, so let's keep making more money. Other alternatives. There's one other prominent group that would have been very interested in this as part of the Great Migration. During these decades after the end of Reconstruction and up to about the 1930s, millions of African Americans left the South and moved to northern cities. So in many cases, the group that would have been happy to work for longer hours or under less pleasant conditions and so on would have been African Americans who had left the South and were looking for employment. In any case, there were lots of people who were willing to work more than the prescribed amount or work for lower than minimum wage or that type of thing. And so in short, one side was saying, look, this is about health and safety. The other side was saying, no, it isn't. It's about keeping certain people out of this profession. And that, as we'll see, becomes a key issue in the 1930s when a series of laws are passed, and in the end, the Supreme Court upholds them. Now, let's generalize this to a pattern in American politics that goes back to before this, in fact, to the founding of the Republic. This is the pattern in the last election. You can see the Obama states in blue, the Romney states in red, and you notice that the red states form kind of an L pattern. That's been true in a lot of recent elections, and actually it's a pattern that goes all the way back to the founding of the American Republic, where one of the political parties, whatever it was at the time, had a strong appeal in urban areas, and another had a strong appeal in more rural areas. So right now, the Democrats are strong in the Northeast and the West Coast, Republicans are strong in the Mountain West and the South, and that kind of pattern has been there really from the very beginning. This is only the most recent manifestation of it. So here we see the map in 2012, and there it is in 2008, similar pattern. Here it is in 2004, in 2000, in 1996, 1992. Notice the L gets fatter when the Republicans are doing well and gets thinner and gets interrupted when they're not doing well. But the basic pattern is there throughout all of those elections. Well, it does go back to the earliest days of the US. One party has tended to represent urban interests. What does that mean? Well, usually it means creditors, finance, big business, industry, the very rich, but also the very poor. And the other party tends to represent the countryside, debtors, people with mortgages, farmers, small business owners, small towns, and to a large extent the middle class. Now here's the weird thing. In the 20th century, the two parties switched places with respect to which groups they were representing and who was their primary support. So here, for example, is the election pattern in 1896. William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat, won the L states, and strong in the Northeast, the North Central states on the coast, that was the Republican, William McKinley, who's been in the news today because Mount McKinley is no longer to be called Mount McKinley. There is the pattern in 1900 between the same two people. Here it is in 1904. That looks like a north-south thing, but once you see the L pattern, you realize actually it's just part of an L. Here it is in 1908. And then you get the election of 1912. That's when Wilson was elected president. He took the blue states there. What happened is that he won, but with only 42% of the vote. The Republican Party split. The Republicans nominated Taft, and Teddy Roosevelt decided to run as a third-party candidate on what he called the Bull Moose platform. And so he took some states, the ones marked in green. The Republicans won, 2 states in red. The Republican candidates together got a majority of the vote, but since the party was split, Wilson became president. The L pattern isn't obvious there, but it's more obvious, well, a little more obvious if you look at it by county, and you can see to a greater extent an L type of pattern, though even then, it would only emerge really clearly if you took the Roosevelt and Taft votes and put them together. Well, in 1916, when Wilson ran for re-election, it looked like this, a very big fat L. There he defeated Charles Evans Hughes, the only Supreme Court justice ever to run for president. Now, I want you to compare the pattern in 2004 with that in 1916. They're actually almost identical, just with the colors flipped. So the question is, what on earth happened? How did it happen that the two parties reversed the patterns of support throughout the country? Well, 1912 was actually crucial to that because it was the election where the Democratic Party changed its nature very fundamentally. In the 19th century, all of the parties were really followers of Locke. They all believed in a kind of bottom-up version of the Enlightenment philosophy we've talked about. So everybody, Republican, Democrat, Whig, Federalist, they were all really Lockeans, but Lockeans of slightly different stripes. They all believed in natural individual rights. They differed about how much power people would cede to the government, and so there were real differences. On the other hand, there was a huge realm of agreement between them. Here was the Republican idea. The Republican Party descended from the Whigs, who descended from the Federalists. The issue that really defined the Republican Party from the beginning was slavery. It was born as an anti-slavery party, and because the Whig Party couldn't quite decide what it thought about slavery, the Republican Party just sort of took over from the Whigs. But if you go back earlier to this sort of ideal, it was defined by Henry Clay, who set out a political program he called the American Way. And it came down to this: having tariffs, which was a big issue at the end of the 19th century, a federal bank, and government-supported infrastructure, building transportation, roads, canals, railways, and so forth. The idea here was to construct a framework for liberty. So it wasn't quite John Stuart Mill's idea that government could only restrict liberty to prevent harm to others, but it was very close to that. Government could prevent people from harming others and also construct this framework for liberty. Construct this common framework where people could then exercise liberty within the framework. Even John Stuart Mill had recognized that in the Principles of Political Economy. He said, of course, government can also define weights and measures and build canals and bridges and things like that. And it was that was really the Republican ideal. And actually, to a large extent, remains the Republican ideal. In the 19th century, the Democratic Party was actually to the right of the Republican Party. It was a small government party. It thought that gave the federal government way too much power. And so it was a party that believed in free trade, in low taxes, in hard money, and in minimal government. It insisted on a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which meant that it was following strict limits on government power. Well, in the 20th century, the Democratic Party changed dramatically. As the 20th century unfolded, the Democratic Party turned around on all of these issues. It became a party that, in general, defended protectionism, that became a party for higher taxes, that inflated the currency, and that argued for a very loose interpretation of the Constitution that allowed for a much more expansive vision of government power. Well, there's a lot that could be said about how that change took place. But the key person was really William Jennings Bryan. He was a 3-time Democratic presidential candidate, starting in 1896 and then 1900. 1908, he added an income tax, also prohibition and the war on drugs to his platform. And it was really Jennings who took over, you might say, the Democratic Party. At the time, he was a populist who didn't really fit into the reigning Democratic Party very well, but he changed the nature of the party, even though he lost all those elections. Here's an editorial cartoon from the time that indicated this. That is William Jennings Bryan swallowing up, at least the 19th century Democratic Party, and turning it into a different kind of party. Well, I'm interested in the idea behind progressivism, and so here's the key thing from our point of view. The 19th century Democratic Party was committed to decentralization. Decentralization of political power, decentralization of economic power. The idea was that both political decisions and economic choices should rest in the hands of the people, insofar as that was possible. Preventing harm to others was really about the only justification for restricting that liberty and centralizing any degree of power. What convinced Bryan that that wasn't right was the rise of the corporation. He said, look, as the 19th century is ending, corporations are becoming larger and larger. They're taking over more and more economic power. They have more and more power over the lives of people. And so in a time of small farmers, small business owners, it was fine to say things are good on their own. We don't have to interfere. But the rise of the corporation is centralizing power. Some people are becoming enormously wealthy. Other people are being left behind. Some people are becoming very powerful. The industrial magnates who control chemical industry, oil, steel, and other large industries. And so he has this view that economic power is centralizing, and it's a threat to the liberty of everyone else. His solution was to create a very strong central government power to counteract the power of the corporations. So the thought was you have to centralize political power and then use it against corporations trying to keep economic power decentralized, to try to fight inequality. Not only inequality of income or wealth, but inequality of power in society by centralizing political power. Well, this raises a number of questions. One is, what is progressivism exactly? When you look it up, in a sort of study of history, it ends up being, well, really a commitment to the idea of progress, but beyond that, it's very hard to find anything informative. Last time we defined socialism as the centralized conscious direction of social forces to consciously chosen ends. Here's one way of trying to understand what the progressive is doing. The progressive does believe in the centralization of political power in order to fight the forces of inequality. And so there is a large amount of overlap here. The progressive believes in the centralized conscious direction of social forces, but now for a specific purpose. Given the name, well, to promote progress, as progressives define it. But what does that really mean? Part of what it means is to counter the concentration of economic power. And so the idea is that you should have a central power that makes decisions that decentralize things and push power back down. Power is sort of naturally flowing up is the idea, and you have to have some strong power at the top to push it back down and to counteract that natural force. You might say that the 19th century Democrats were optimists who thought that the economy, if left alone, would produce a just society. And in the 20th century, they became increasingly convinced that the economy, if left alone, would produce an unjust society. And government power was needed to counteract it. Well, there is a puzzle that this raises. I call it the paradox of progressivism, but it's a problem that in a way anybody thinking about these issues has to confront. Why won't that centralization threaten liberty just as much as the centralization the progressive is trying to prevent? That is to say, the worry is that corporations are having too much power. But by centralizing power in government, you're in effect producing this great mega corporation that's even bigger. Why is that a good idea? Why will that not be corruptive in exactly the same ways that the corporate powers were corrupting? In fact, if anything, you might worry that it'll be worse. Government has more power. It has the power to coerce you. Private companies don't have it. I mean, Apple Computer, can it force you to do anything? You can choose not to buy its products, but government can force you to do things. It can't say, you are now convicted of murder. And you say, I've had it with this. I'm out of here. Right? I no longer submit to your authority. You can't do it. And so government has a coercive power. It has greater power. It's also less accountable. You can actually stop buying the product of the corporation. You can't just easily stop living under the government, though of course you might emigrate. Now, in any case, that is a puzzle that I think anyone who thinks about progressivism has to confront and provide some kind of answer for. Here's another way of looking at the same problem. Progressives attack trusts, attack monopolies. In fact, the Federal Trade Commission, pictured there, and the Clayton Antitrust Act were major achievements in 1914. But now, isn't government the ultimate monopoly? It has a monopoly on political power, so why doesn't the same set of problems arise? In any event, this becomes expressed in the problem known in political theory as regulatory capture. Why won't the government and the corporations actually band together against anyone else? After all, the corporations have all this power. Government may start centralizing power to work against them. But why won't the corporations or other strong interest groups, special interests, actually end up manipulating the government in its favor? It's sometimes called the problem of the iron triangle. The special interests, the bureaucracy in government, the congressional committees, there tends to be a transfer of people so that these are largely the same people switching jobs. Well, anyway, here's what it really comes down to for our purposes. In the 1912 election, the Democratic Party jumped from the right to the left. It had been jumping with William Jennings Bryan, but it was really the first time, you might say, that it got a chance to implement the results of that shift. And that was with the president. Oh, I'm sorry. I am allergic to chalk, which is a bad thing for a college professor. And now I'm really, I need to blow my nose and I have nothing to blow it on. I don't really want to gross you out by using my sleeve, so I will just snort unpleasantly and edit this out of the video. Oh, that makes it worse. Oh. Okay. Okay. Well, yes. Back to Woodrow Wilson. Now, here he is throwing out the first pitch on the opening day of the baseball season. Wilson advocates a new spirit of the age. He expresses a commitment to radical change. And so his idea is that government has to alter the structure of society for a new set of economic conditions. He says this is nothing short of a new social age, a new era of human relationships, a new stage setting for the drama of life. Now, what does he mean? Well, he sees the rise of the corporation as having altered the economy in a fundamental way. He says we are in a temper to reconstruct economic society as we were once in a temper to reconstruct political society, and political society may itself undergo a radical modification in the process. Well, why? It's because there are progressive forces that he thinks it's important to act upon. He had been president of Princeton before becoming governor of New Jersey, and he said, I used to say, when I was president of Princeton, I wanted to make the young gentlemen of the rising generation as unlike their fathers as possible. Why? Not because their fathers lacked character or intelligence or knowledge or patriotism, because their fathers were out of sympathy with the creative, formative, and progressive forces of society. Well, what are these progressive forces? What does he mean? Here are the basic doctrines that Wilson puts forward for his version of progressivism. The first one is a biological metaphor. The state is organic. It is to be viewed as one organism. It is not a social contract, It is something like an organism, or at some point he compares it to a beehive, as we'll see. Second, holism. The individual has value only in the context of the state. Do we start from individual rights? No. Individual rights are nonsense, he says. Actually, what we have to care about is the health of the state. Third, liberty is coordination with the state. In Hobbes, liberty is doing what you want to do, doing things without external impediments. He says, no, it's coordination. It's doing the right thing in the context of the state. Authority. Everything is political. All decisions, all facets of life are political and subject to the authority of the state. Utopianism. No trade-offs have to be made. The state can sort out all problems successfully. And finally, the state can do no wrong. There's a doctrine of infallibility. In short, for Wilson, the state is a bit like the Pope in Catholic doctrine. When the Pope is speaking ex cathedra, he's infallible, he's the ultimate authority, really everything is in principle within the Pope's purview. It's like that. Now let's talk about each of these. The biological metaphor. Is the state an organism? Well, here's a little picture of the social contract. He says, you don't kill me, I won't kill you. He says, hey, sounds great. Okay? It all depends on you and I having individual rights, and we form this sort of contract. From another point of view, you could say it's like an ecosystem. He says, well, no, really, think of the state as like an organism. The organism may be healthy or unhealthy. The state may be healthy or unhealthy. And this is in opposition to, for example, the advocates of the free market who see society as more like an ecosystem. Progress is arising from a process of natural selection and random mutation, competition, and so forth. But no, here Wilson is a follower of a German philosopher, Hegel, who sees society as something like one organism. The parts all have to work together. And at one point, Wilson says, indeed, it doesn't make any sense to have the different parts operating against each other. Holism, well, really you only have worth within the context of a political structure. Hegel had said all worth the human being has, he has only through the state. And that's something Wilson actually ends up advocating. Freedom is coordination with the rest of the state. So, think of the state as something like a team. That is Harvard beating Dartmouth to win the college football championship in 1912. And think of it as something like teamwork. Here is Wilson's statement on what liberty is. He says, I long ago had an image in my mind of what constitutes liberty. Suppose that I were building a great piece of powerful machinery. Suppose I should so awkwardly, unskillfully assemble the parts that every time one part tried to move would be interfered with by the others. The whole thing would buckle up and be checked. Liberty for the several parts would consist in the best possible assembling and adjustment of them all, would it not? And so your freedom is to be found in the perfect adjustments of parts of society. Well, here's how he expresses it. Human freedom consists in perfect adjustments of human interests and human activities and human energies. So it's everybody working together. Now, in some respects, this was undoubtedly a positive thing. So, for example, in 1916 and again in 1918, there were prohibitions of child labor. There was the 17th Amendment that actually required direct election of senators. Given the people in the Senate since this passed, compared to earlier American statesmen, I'm not sure that was a good thing, but in any event, then finally the women obtained the right to vote in 1920. And it was Warren G. Harding who was actually the first president elected with women having the right to vote. But other aspects of this were not very positive. Wilson segregated the federal government, including the military. The government had, since the Civil War, been thoroughly integrated. Blacks and whites worked together in the same offices. Wilson reversed that and made some government offices whites only, others blacks only. He and the progressive movement in general promoted eugenics and urged that, well, certain people be encouraged to breed, that others be discouraged. Planned Parenthood was founded around this time to keep down the immigrant and the black population. He started, in effect, a race war. There was a high point of lynchings. Here you see someone who had been lynched having their body burned in Omaha. The result of that was a series of race riots that continued throughout 1918, 1919, 1920. Here you see a riot sparked in Omaha by a lynching. Here, 62 lynchings during 1918, race riots flare in Nebraska and Arkansas, 8,000 troops are ordered out in Chicago, numerous race riots throughout the South and the Midwest, 26 dead in Chicago, riots in Washington. There was the first military draft since the Civil War. Also, Wilson got passed with the help of the Democrats in Congress, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. What were these acts? Well, they made it illegal to oppose the First World War. They made it illegal to oppose the draft. Anyone using disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language could be imprisoned. This was not merely theoretical. 400 publications lost their mailing privileges, and more than 1,000 people were convicted under these acts. Perhaps the most famous was E.E. Cummings, the poet, who, in Europe, traveling, said that he didn't hate Germans. For saying that, he served 3.5 months in jail. Wilson also created the War Industries Board. It was an industrial dictatorship without parallel, one historian has said. It told people what they could produce and when. Prohibition passed by constitutional amendment in 1919. That was one of the big objectives of the progressive movement. Here you see people dumping barrels of beer into the sewer. God, tragic. Wilson also was somebody who helped to start the war on drugs at the federal level. And then he created the Committee of Public Information. It was a propaganda effort. Here you see various forms of propaganda. He had a group of people called the 4-Minute Men who would go around the country and support the administration's positions in various meetings. The head of that said truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. They're lifeless truths and vital lies. The most famous bit of propaganda from that era is this. And finally, well, I shouldn't say finally, but the key point for us is, according to Wilson, there is really no limit at all to government power. This means rethinking the way we contemplate the Constitution, because the Constitution seems to place very clear limits on power. And so in the end, he said everything is political. He said, I believe the time has come when government has to exercise power in every relationship of life. And so his vision is that government authority is in principle unlimited and indeed infallible. He says, I cannot imagine power as a thing negative and not positive in the hands of the government. He called inalienable rights nonsense and a mere vague sentiment. And finally, well, yes, gosh, I'm running out of time, but his vision in the end of a successful human society is a beehive. Next time we'll talk about World War I. We'll think about how that will start